Hello everyone, and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. Today I'm going to tackle one of the major difficulties that every speculative fiction author has to face, the fact that you're writing about something that doesn't exist. One of the basic rules of writing is to write what you know, and that's hard to do when you don't know what the future holds. You've never lived like a medieval peasant, you've never faced a dragon in single combat, and you've never traveled into space. Still, speculative fiction authors write about the impossible every day, and you can do it too. It all starts with a single word: research. If you haven't experienced enough to describe what doesn't exist, you can still learn enough through research to fake it. Start with what you know. Even if your setting takes place thousands of years in the future or in an alternate universe, it will still, in some ways, resemble the world and the culture that you live in. Maybe that means it's not as authentic as it could be, but the point of speculative fiction isn't to be authentic to the times and places you're imagining. It's to tell stories about who you are and what you think, and share them with people who also live here and now. Speculative fiction is just an excuse to get creative. Authors always put some of themselves in their stories, and you should never try to avoid that. What this means is that if you live, say, in the United States, the protagonists you want your audience to like will, to some extent, reflect American values, even if they live in a medieval kingdom or on an alien planet. If you create a society or a nation that you want your audience to root for, that nation will have values that you find positive, and their enemies will have values that you consider negative. Now, you can always mix things up, and you should avoid creating flawless characters in utopian societies, but in the end, you will create your speculative setting on the foundation of your own real experiences. And that's fine, because your audience will be experiencing your setting using their own foundational experiences. Another way you can highlight your personal knowledge is by focusing your stories and your settings around your hobbies and interests. R.A. Salvatore worked as a bouncer before he started writing fiction, and as a result, his Forgotten Realms novels feature very detailed and descriptive personal combat. Mercedes Lackey lives in the country and works with animals, and so her Valdemar setting features a bunch of magical horses that move and act like real horses. Isaac Asimov wrote scientific nonfiction throughout his career, and so his science fiction always features realistic physics and chemistry. Focusing on your interests when writing fiction will almost always improve it. Extrapolate from known points. Your knowledge and experiences are always good places to start, but you can write regular fiction if that's all you're going to do. Speculative fiction goes beyond what's known or even what's possible. And yet if you want to create relatable stories, then your setting should still have something to do with reality as we know it. Most importantly, it should feature people whose mentalities are still recognizable as people. Fortunately, that's not hard to do, since human minds are really the only reference point we have for intelligence. Extrapolating from known points means starting with something real and pushing out from there. The original Star Wars A New Hope features creative spaceship designs and a space station the size of a small moon, but during the final battle, those ships act like fighter planes, and the long trench run at the end was taken directly from the 1955 movie The Dam Busters. The Foundation series by Isaac Asimov features a galactic empire and impossibly precise societal predictions. But Asimov's initial inspiration was the book series titled The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The reason it's important to start with something real is because it's just as easy to start with something fictional. Instead of using a historical war movie, you could potentially start with Star Wars and exaggerate from there to create your setting. However, adding extra layers of fantasy on top of fantasy carries the risk that you'll end up in a place too far away from the real world for anyone to care about your story. You end up relying on cliches and references instead of real experiences. If you ask me, that's a part of the reason why a lot of Star Wars Expanded Universe books are of poor quality. It's because the authors are trying to create more Star Wars, and they aren't trying to bring more reality into the Star Wars setting. Use the 5 senses. This advice is good for any kind of description you create, for any kind of story you write, whether it's speculative fiction, mainstream fiction, or even narrative nonfiction. You need to engage all 5 senses if you want to paint the fullest possible picture of the world you're creating. Appearances are important. Vision is the most important sense in human physiology, but we experience the world through 5 senses, or 11, depending on how you count them. So you can get away with just visual and auditory descriptions, but when you describe scents, textures, tastes, and flavors, you will make your setting seem more realistic, even if it couldn't possibly be real. Let me illustrate what I mean with that floating islands setting I keep bringing up. As Jane knelt by the edge of the world, she studied the roiling clouds below her. She had heard the booming echoes of thunder when she was still a dozen miles away from the edge, but here they were much louder and clearer, and she could see the flashing lightning below that was causing it. Glancing up, she studied the clear blue sky and warm sun above her, and marveled at how both these skies could exist at the same time. A cool breeze rustled the leaves of the trees behind her and ran over her bare arms, and while it wasn't very strong, it made her nervous enough to step back from the edge. Still, nervous or not, it was a great day to test her new flying machine. Jane looked down at her blackened, grease-covered hands and considered whether she should clean up before eating the sandwich Jack had packed her that morning, or whether the taste of iron and engine oil would be a nice change of pace from the dry turkey and plain lettuce Jack always used. Now, one warning I would give you is that as you add more description, the pace of the story slows down. That's perfectly acceptable, or even preferable when you're introducing a new location or when your characters are just waiting around, but when the action picks up, you should keep your descriptions short and sweet. Just make sure that you give a nod to the other senses, even when you're in a hurry. Show your work. Much like using all the different senses for descriptions, show, don't tell is always good advice for writing, no matter what genre you work in. Telling your audience how people feel or what qualities a nation has will get you through a description quickly, but you won't engage your audience, and if your characters act against the qualities you give them, your audience won't believe you. Showing also has the advantage of being more creative and more descriptive than telling. The sentence, "Jack obviously didn't believe Jill," gets the point across, but the sentence, "Jack scoffed and shook his head once Jill finished talking," sets a scene and allows your audience to see in their minds what's happening. If you work in a visual medium, then you should take this advice to mean that you should rely on your visual depictions to tell your story as much as possible, instead of leaning on dialogue and narration. In the context of a speculative fiction setting, show your work also means that you should be ready to explain what it is about your setting that makes it unique. What period of history is it like? What does local culture value and not value? How does magic work? How does interstellar travel work? You don't have to explain everything in great detail, and you do have to remember that you're trying to tell a story first, but you should always remember to provide context so that your audience is at least on the same page as your characters. Nonfiction resources. When you want to create a fantasy medieval setting or an alternate history books are going to be your best friends. There are thousands, maybe millions of books to choose from, not to mention all the modern resources like YouTube channels run by historians and history buffs, Wikipedia articles, history blogs, history podcasts, and pretty much anything else you can think of. Gathering details from places like these can help you understand how people lived 1,000 years ago, what they worried about, how politics functioned, and why people made the decisions they did. Another way nonfiction research helps is by showing you places and cultures that you've never encountered in person. Traveling to new places and experiencing new things for yourself is always the best way to learn, but if you don't have the opportunity or the money to spend on vacations, then you can still pick up a lot from travelogues, nature photography, survival shows, and other such resources. You can also use nonfiction sources to understand magic better. Magic may not be real, but that didn't stop people from believing in it for thousands of years, and it still doesn't stop some people today from believing in magic or some other form of superstitious thinking. You can find a lot of resources about how magic supposedly works, both ancient and contemporary, and you can use these books and websites to come up with ideas for how your setting's magic should work. As for science fiction, news articles about science can be very inspirational. You might see an article about a recent invention that could have some very interesting implications. Or maybe you'll find an article about some theoretical quantum particle, or a suggestion about how warp speed could work. Even if you want to make a soft science fiction setting and you don't care if everything sounds plausible, learning about the basics of modern science will allow you to fill your setting with details that will draw your audience in. Fiction resources. Every modern fiction author builds on the stories that came before them. The stories we consume enter our memories, mix themselves into our consciousness, and then combine together in strange new formations as we build our own stories. Consuming a wide variety of fictional stories is just as important as studying nonfiction when it comes to developing your own speculative fiction setting. For one thing, other speculative fiction authors do their own research, and so you can end up learning something about real history and science from a fictional source. Consuming fiction can also help you understand how to write a good story with good characters in an interesting setting. Another thing you can do is borrow ideas that another author comes up with, although you should be careful about how directly you borrow ideas, both to avoid going too far away from reality, like I said earlier, and to avoid accusations of plagiarism. Multimedia Resources. A picture can say 1,000 words, which means it can be a very efficient way to research. Books and text are at least what I think about first when I think about speculative fiction writing, but it's important to remember that there are also painters, filmmakers, game developers, playwrights, television studios, musicians, and all kinds of other artists who also work in the speculative fiction genre. If that weren't the case, then I'd never be able to find images to illustrate this video series. Using these multimedia resources can really help you create a mental picture of what you want your setting to look like. It can also open you up to new possibilities you might not have otherwise considered, and it will definitely help you describe your setting as an author or as a fellow artist. So don't let media elitism of any sort hold you back from exploring every format available to you. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into weaving worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.